Welcome to the next episode of Brandland. I'm Garrett Justice, and today I'm joined by Gabrielle Dolan, who's a speaker, author, and founder at Jargon Free Fridays. Gabrielle, how are you doing today?
I am good, Garrett. It's good to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on the show. Joining us a little bit from the future. You're in Australia. We're here in the United States and Melbourne. Is that right?
Yes, well, Melbourne, as we
Yeah, I
and
know. I know.
Americans always say it Melbourne. We just say it as Melbourne.
Melbourne. Okay, I'll try and fix that. And so we're super excited to have you on the show today. I know you have just recently launched a new book. This is number 6 for you. Is that right?
It is number 6. If someone had told me 10 years ago I would have written one book, I would have found that hard to believe, let alone 6.
And this one is called Magnetic Stories, right?
Yeah, it's magnetic stories, connect with customers and engage employees through brand storytelling, which I sort of secretly really love the name.
Yeah, I love it too. And I'm excited to dive in and kind of understand what it's about and some of the principles that you share in it. But before we do that, tell our listeners a little bit more about your background. Again, this context of having written multiple books and as well as Jargon Free Fridays. That sounds intriguing. Tell us more about that.
Well, Jargon Free Fridays is, I guess, a fun way to raise awareness to what I think is a pretty serious problem in business with our addiction to acronyms and jargon. And look, I'm not against jargon because a lot of us use it. We're not even realizing we use it. And I'm not against acronym, but it's just the complete overuse of it. It's just like anything that's like 3 words, we feel the need to reduce to acronyms. And it's really dangerous when we're communicating and marketing, because an acronym could mean one thing to you, but there's going to be multiple variations and it will mean something different to someone else.
Yeah, I love that idea. And I guess, you know what that reminds me of, Gabrielle, is years ago when I worked at Target, a large retailer here in the US, when I remember first starting, and someone shared with me a link to an internal intranet page where people had outlined, it was 3 or 4 pages of all the internal acronyms that people used at the company for, these 3 letters mean this, these 3 mean that. I remember going through that. So I totally get what you're saying there.
Garrett, nearly all companies have that. I think it's one of the most ridiculous band-aid solutions. It was like, sort of, let's not have them in the first place. I remember very early on in my career, I was a mainframe computer operator, which sort of tells my age because there's not many companies that have mainframes anymore. And I remember the fan had broken on the IBM computer, so I had to ring up to find a part. So I'm looking under F, and this wasn't 3 or 4 pages. This was like 50 pages, and I couldn't find the part number for fan, so I had to ring them. And when I rang them, they said it's not under fan, it's under A for air movement device. Air movement device. It's just like, and that always stuck with me, like how ridiculous acronyms are. And maybe that's where the little seed of Jargon Free Friday started about, I don't know, that must have been like about 30 years ago, I think.
Oh, I love it. Well, you'll have to correct me because I know I still trip up. I still, use some of that jargon sometimes. So correct me today as we go through this if need be. So, well, tell us a little bit more about your career too. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear that context.
Yeah, I started as a trainee computer operator because I wanted to be a graphic designer. I always wanted to be a graphic designer. I did graphic design in my last couple of years at school. And I didn't get good enough marks to get into the graphic design course. And I think I was actually a pretty good student up until about, year 10, which is about 3 years left of school. And then, you sort of get 15 and 16 and you become really way too cool for school. And I think that was just me. I didn't even know what I was doing, but I stopped putting in the effort. So I didn't get very good marks in my final year of school. In fact, I failed English in my final year of school by 1%. I was just like, I think I was aiming for a 51% and got a 49%. So what I ended up doing is I ended up getting a trainee computer operator job, so I didn't get enough marks to get into my graphic designer course. So I went and got a job as a trainee computer operator because one of the other subjects I was studying, and this was way back in 1984, I was studying computer science, which was a really, really new subject. So I think the fact that I just knew the difference between a hardware and software got me a job as a computer operator. And I did that for a couple of years in one company, and then moved to another company, which is one of Australia's largest banks. So I was actually there for a long time because, when you're in large organisations, you can not only change jobs, but you can actually change careers. So I progressively moved through to leadership roles, into some training and development roles, into leadership programs, change managements. And it was probably in those last couple of years being in a senior leadership role and in change management that I sort of really started to discover how effective storytelling was when you're trying to lead people, when you're trying to communicate people, and when you're trying to influence a change in an organization.
Yeah, fascinating. So much of that I want to just continue to dive into. The first thing I want to know, though, is how does someone who failed English her final year of high school end up becoming an author of 6 books and an expert on storytelling? Tell us more about your story there.
Yeah, well, the short answer is good editors. That's the short answer. But I think if you look at what I'm sort of an expert in, it's storytelling to communicate better, to communicate your brand, your messages better, and this fun thing of Jargon Free Fridays. But ultimately they come under the umbrella of just speaking in a way people understand, like using simple language. It's not about dumbing it down. There's so many people that speak in a way just to, I'm sure it's just to show how they think they're showing how intelligent they are. So I think it sort of almost came from my fact that I kept going, I don't understand what they're saying. And so I left National Australia Bank, the bank I was working at, about 17 years ago, with this concept that I could teach people storytelling. What I started to notice in my last couple of years in the corporate world was the really good leaders were sharing stories. The great presenters were sharing stories. You sort of even looked at the really good marketing ads at the time, and they're all narrative based. So I did a little bit of research, and with this concept of we could start sharing stories in business, and there was no one really doing it. I didn't see anyone doing it. There was an American guy called Steve Denning, who was the CEO, ex senior exec of the World Bank, and he'd written a book on it called The Leader's Guide to Storytelling. And when I read that book, it was almost, I thought that if someone from the World Bank can write a book on storytelling, there's a bit of credibility here. So I left that corporate gig about 16 years ago and literally just started developing my own IP, working with clients, knowing and just teaching them how to communicate more effectively through storytelling. So the 6 books sort of evolved for me, developing all my IP around that. From, the first book was around storytelling. I think the second book was around storytelling. Then it got into just, communicating more effectively. So the 6th book now is around magnetic stories, which sort of appeals to anyone really that's interested in taking their brand more seriously.
Oh, it's fascinating. I have my copy of Magnetic Stories. I know it just barely launched just yesterday. Is that right?
Yeah, it just I finished the manuscript about 6 months. It's about 12 months from thinking of an idea to the book hitting the bookshelf. You spend 6 months of writing, then you go through months of editing, and then it takes a few months to get all printed and hit bookstores. So I had a very fun day yesterday driving around to my local bookstores, taking little snaps of the book on the shelf, because you never, as an author, you never ever lose that excitement.
Yeah, all that work kind of culminating in that event. That's exciting. Well, congratulations on that. I'm excited to dive into my own copy here that you sent me. I appreciate that over the next little bit, but tell our listeners a little bit more about the catalyst for this most recent book of Magnetic Stories. Who is this one intended for, and what's kind of the premise of why this book now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I get asked that a lot, because I must admit the audience for my previous book has predominantly been leaders in an organization, and how do they use storytelling to internally to lead their people, and perhaps externally in sales situations. And I sort of thought I'd done with that. Like, I wrote my last book. In fact, probably the last two books I've written, I think there's nothing more to write. I think I've exhausted everything I need to say on the subject. But what started to happen is I noticed this concept of brand storytelling. I kept hearing that phrase all the time, and it sort of, intrigued me. I started to look into it. And the first thing I noticed is I wasn't sure whether people who were using the term brand storytelling sort of knew what they were talking about. And when I went in further, there was two things I saw. People were talking about sharing a story, like this is our story, or we're using brand storytelling. And when I looked in, they were either calling something a story that wasn't a story, replacing the about us on our website with our time, with the about us with our story. And you go in and look, and it's just a timeline. And I'd find myself going, a timeline is not a story. I'd also be saying brand storytelling isn't just one story. So what I'd see is a lot of people just sharing one story and calling it brand storytelling. But probably the other thing that I really noticed was I would hear companies have these amazing stories to share, like stories how the company started, or how a product started, or about all these amazing things they were doing in the community, or how they faced a challenge. And there was these really good stories that really demonstrated their brand to me, that I think demonstrated, the essence of who they were, either as a company or as a leader. And they weren't sharing them. And they weren't sharing them because they either didn't think there was any power in the story, didn't think anyone would be interested, or I think didn't know how. And so I saw those missed opportunities, and that's when you sort of go, oh, all right, maybe just write another book about it.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I mean, I think it's great because it comes from that experience, right? Of working with all these clients who you've worked with, research that you've done and things that you've seen, and you identified a gap and you went about it. One thing I really like about what you said is, we talk on this podcast a lot about, what a brand is and what it isn't. I'm sure listeners are, have heard me say this before, but I love that you talked about, brand storytelling is helping people understand who you are as an organization, what you stand for, and why they should care. Brand is so much more than just your logo or your colors or things like that, right? It's so much more. It's about the essence of who you are, right? Yeah. And so I love that, that's part of it. So I guess to build on that, what is brand storytelling? How would you kind of define that? I think we got to scratch the surface there a little bit, but what is it and why is it important?
Yeah. So in the book, I go, before I can sort of talk about what brand storytelling is, it's like, what is brand? And it's exactly what you were saying, Garrett. It's like, to me, it's not a brand. It's not a logo, rather. It's not a tagline. It's not a slick corporate video. It's not just, and it's just not one story. So to me, brand, your brand, and all of us have a brand. Every individual has a brand. A team has a brand. Our company has a brand. We all have a brand, whether we know it or not, we all have one. And to me, it's the stories people share about you. That's your brand. So based on that, then it is brand storytelling is, what are the things you are doing to create those stories, and what are the stories that you are proactively sharing to demonstrate that brand. So again, it's being clear on, it's like what you spoke about, that's the essence of who you are. To me, that's your values. Like, what are your values? What do you stand for? That's your brand. Doing things that are in line with that brand, but also actively sharing stories that demonstrate and communicate that brand. I'll give you an example of what, and I came across this probably just in the very early stages where I was forming the idea of the book. And when I heard this, to me, this is the essence of, this is what brand storytelling is about, and this is the power of a story. When I was growing up, I was a bit of a tomboy. I was just, riding my skateboard, into BMX bikes, into playing football, cricket with my brothers. And I never was into dolls. I think I had a very short stint I was into a doll, but I never was into doll. And I never had a Barbie. And so decades later, the last few decades, where Barbie has sort of been slammed a bit for body shaming, women, that the shape of Barbie is so unrealistic, and it's a bad role model for girls. So I happily went along with that story. And then I heard a woman speaking about the backstory of Barbie, and the backstory is that Ruth Handler was the wife of the co-founder of Mattel. And she noticed that when her two children were playing with their dolls, that they were pretending to be adults. And what she found is her daughter, Barbara, and her son, Ken, and yes, Ken and Barbie were named after her children, but when her daughter, Barbara, was playing with her dolls, pretending to be adults, the only thing she could see herself was a caregiver, because that was the dolls, where her son, Ken, could imagine himself as an astronaut or a firefighter or a doctor. And so she pitched the idea to the Mattel execs of making an adult 3D figure with fabric clothes that, the adult could change into whatever she wanted to be. And they weren't impressed. Anyway, she persisted, and they launched Barbie in 1959 at the New York Toy Fair, and pretty much the rest is history, they say. But Ruth Handler is quoted as saying, "My whole philosophy of Barbie was that through the doll, the little girl could be anything she wanted to be. Barbie always represented the fact that women have choices." On hearing that one story, it completely changed my opinion of the brand of Barbie. And not only changed my opinion, but will influence my future buying decisions. So I've never bought a Barbie for my two daughters, but maybe I might just buy a Barbie for, any future grandkids that come along. And so that's when it was like that one story changed my perception of the brand. And then I think where the missed opportunity is I went looking for that story because I wanted to research it to make sure I had it right. And it is on the Mattel website, but it's hidden. Like I had to spend, it was only because I was researching the book, I kept looking. To me, that type of story should be front and center of the website. It should be on the packaging of every Barbie product. I mean, I don't know if it is or not, but if it's not, it should be. That's the power of how that's one story. Story that could be one of the many stories that fall into brand storytelling.
Oh, such an excellent example. I have two young daughters, and I resonate with that story too. I haven't been one to buy Barbies or dolls for them in the past, but hearing that story, I might in the future as well. I mean, I think it's powerful.
Yeah. And you know what? 9 out of 10 people I tell that story to or have read the book have that same perception of Barbie. And it was like, and again, you just think it, and we're all in a position now where adults potentially deciding to buy a Barbie for our children or not. And that story would influence so many buying decisions.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Something that reminds me of too, and something that you said earlier, tying into brand, it reminds me of a quote by Jeff Bezos, the Amazon CEO, I believe it was, who said that a brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room, right? So again, similar to what you said is those, not only the stories that you're telling as an organization, but what are the stories that are being told about you as an organization, and how does that influence people's perception of your organization and your company?
Yeah, absolutely. And I attribute that quote, that Jeff in the book, that quote, because I know, but when he said, but what people say about you, I've sort of just taken it one little bit further and said, the stories people share about you, because normally that's what they'll end up telling, is a story.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm curious then, hearing that premise for this book and all this research that went into it, all the work that you've done with clients, what are some of the most common mistakes that you see companies making when it comes to brand storytelling?
Yeah, look, I think one of the common mistakes we sort of spoke about is where they think it's just one story. So, and it's normally what I call the creation story. So how the company started. So they think that is the brand storytelling, but then sometimes they tell it in a way that sort of sounds like a timeline, not like a story. So they're very on this date we did this and then we did this. So that's one of the mistakes. I think the other mistake they make is they're not educating their employees on the power of brand storytelling. So I'm very much one of brand storytelling doesn't belong in the marketing department. It doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
It belongs, the marketing department, I know may drive it, but brand storytelling is the responsibility of every employee, because every decision a leader makes affects the brand. Every customer interaction affects the brand. So I think there's a missed opportunity when we don't educate all our employees on the power of brand storytelling and empowering them, especially people in the frontline staff, to create stories. So then part of that whole, that like once you know what your brand is and once you've educated your people, we start this like circular ongoing process of collecting stories, communicating them, and creating stories. And what I mean by create stories is what you do that generates stories. There's an example in my book that I love it. I've heard about this example like probably a decade ago, and it's from 1975 from a Nordstrom store in America. And the story goes that there was this man bought a set of tires from a tire shop, and a few months later went back to change the tires. You've probably heard of this.
Yeah, I have.
And a few months later went back to get a refund on the tires, and the tire store was no longer there, but there was a Nordstrom store in its place, a brand new Nordstrom store. And the shop assistant refunded the man's tires, even though Nordstrom don't even sell tires. Now, if you Google Nordstrom tires, customer service, you get over like 7 million references to that. That was 46 years ago, and people are still talking about that story. And so part of me, it was like this: how do you find stories and share them? I've researched that story extensively, and I cannot find out whether the customer shared the story or the company shared the story. I suspect it's the company. But imagine if no one had shared that story. Like, imagine if that had have happened and then no one heard about it. It's sort of almost like, if a tree falls in a forest, does it make it sound? It was like, if your employees are doing amazing things like that really demonstrate your brand, that demonstrated the essence who you are, but you're not finding those stories and sharing them, then that's such a missed opportunity.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And yeah, I have definitely heard that classic story before. So good. So I guess on the flip side of that, on the flip side of those mistakes, how do you really do it well? Like, what are the things that the best companies are doing when it comes to brand storytelling?
Yeah, look, I think you start off with defining your brand. And to me, again, this is, I know there's a whole elements to brand like logo and tagline and colors and all that type of stuff. And I get that. But to me, this around storytelling, it's defining what you want to be known for. And to me, that's your values. So if we're going back to, brand is the stories people are telling you. What stories are they telling you? Are the stories all about exceptional customer service, or is it about crap customer service? Is it about a really inclusive culture, or is it the opposite of that? Is it around integrity, or the opposite of that? So you've got to be really clear on what you want to be known for. Now, a lot of companies do this, where they have their purpose and their mission and their values. So a lot of companies do that. But then the next process is educating everyone around this concept of brand storytelling, that everything they do can create stories, but also what stories are we finding we can share. And I also do spend a bit of time on really educating perhaps the senior leaders on telling stories well. I did some work with a company, an American-owned company in Vietnam, but they're an investment banking company. And I spent over about 6 months' time, about 5 days with them. I kept flying back and forth from Australia to Vietnam. They had this aim to collect 100 stories over the year of them living their values and what they believed was the essence of them. In the end, I showed them the process of how you actively find them and how they put in some really cool things to find them, continually share them internally. They have over 400 stories now that they share. I mean, this is over a couple of years, But and then it's finding ways to share them. So it's defining what your brand is, educating your people, and then starting this process of how you continually collect stories, communicate them, and create them, and communicate them in a whole heap of ways. So again, it is on your website. I mean, that's a no-brainer. Yeah. But stuff like induction programs, I can't believe people run induction programs, and it should just be story after story after story. I know, for example, Nordstrom's, you know, if you start working for Nordstrom's and you hear that tire story and go, that's what we mean by exceptional customer service. Do whatever you need to do. It's gonna sort of induct people into the culture of the organization and do it well. And then really getting really creative on sharing other stories. There's one of the stories I share, and I actually dedicate a whole chapter to them. It's Columbia Restaurants in Florida. So it's the oldest restaurants in Florida, and they're doing amazing things with storytelling. There's stories on their menus, there's stories in their wine lists, on their social media sites. They share, you know, really great stories about their customers. When I interviewed for them for the book, I asked them when they sort of made this commitment to storytelling. Like they're a fifth generational family-owned business, and I thought they were going to say like 10 years ago or something. Their answer was 1946 is when they made the commitment. So they hired a journalist to write a daily column, but not about the restaurant, about what they call them, the characters of the restaurant. So the customers that had been going there for 20 years, the barman that had worked there for 30 years. So they just shared these stories about the people associated with the restaurant. And so, I mean, that is a true commitment to brand storytelling.
Yeah, it's fascinating, man. You are just making me really excited to dive into this book and hear all these awesome stories and this process. So this is excellent. So the next question I have for you is really, you know, you've talked about how one of the biggest mistakes that companies make is assuming that there's just one story that you tell. And, you know, you shared examples of, you know, other companies like what you just shared, where they're telling potentially hundreds of stories. So what are the main types of stories that businesses should share? How do businesses identify which are the stories they should promote and share and capture, and which ones don't really matter that maybe they should ignore? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Garrett, when I started writing this book, sort of like any book, most business books are around about 50,000 words, and I get into about 15,000 where I've got everything out of my head, and then I sort of go, yeah, well, I'm done. This is going to be a really short book, or I need to get out and speak to people. And I knew I needed to get out and speak to and find all these examples. So doing that, I sort of thought, I reckon by the end, I'm going to come up with the X amount of stories, whether it's 3 or 5 or 8 or whatever. But I knew there'd be different types of stories. As it came out, there was 5. And I guess it's the way you sort of categorize them. But the first is, and they all start with C, because I do like a good palette when it comes to these things. But they did actually logically fall into these. So the first type is creation stories. So that is not only how the company founded, but it also could be how a product started. So the story of Barbie, that's a creation story for Barbie, how Barbie started. So you've got these creation stories. And as we've spoken about, sometimes that's the only story people share. So we've got the creation story. The other story is the culture stories. So these are stories about, there's sort of 2 aspects of this, is the senior leaders sharing personal stories around what the company values mean to them, because I think that really helps set the culture of an organization. But then it's stories that of your employees living the values. So, you know, that Nordstrom story is a great example of an employee living the value. And they're the ones that can be, you know, shared in induction programs and, you know, these days internally on Yammer and stuff like that. So they're there. So creation and culture stories. The other stories are customer stories. So sharing stories, not necessarily just sharing stories about the good things you've done for customers, because that can feel like a little bit bragging, but maybe making your customers the hero of the story. So I'll give you an example from the Columbia Restaurant Group. They share on their Facebook page. I saw something on Valentine's Day where they shared a story of a couple that had been going to their restaurant, I think it was like for 52 years. for
Wow.
their wedding anniversary. So they went to there for their wedding anniversary, for their first wedding anniversary, and the second wedding anniversary they went back and just coincidentally got sat at the same table. Columbia Restaurant now save that table for them on the same day every year, and they come back to that. So it's making can you sort of see those stories? It's making the customers the hero, but at the same time you're going, God, that must be a bloody good restaurant for them to go back. So it's sort of, it's subtle. Those stories are subtle. So customer stories. The other one are community stories. So perhaps the good things that you're doing in the community. But also, again, maybe it's your employees are just doing really, really good things in their own community that's got, nothing to do with your company or nothing to the products you sell. You're just making your employees the hero of the story. And again, by default, it was like, God, they got great employees. So, maybe great company. And the other one is challenge stories. So how have you responded to challenge? Now, we saw so many of those stories come out of the last 12 months. I could have potentially had another C category, Corona or COVID. But yeah, it's a lot of them by default fell into challenge stories. And so I think the idea with the 5 is just to encourage people to look beyond the obvious of stories, and to think of them. You don't have to get too hung up on, is this a culture story or a community story? It doesn't. You don't have to categorize it, because we're not doing that. It's just reaching far and wide. I'll give you another quick example. During March last year, when the whole world went into lockdown, there was a gin bar in Sydney, and I think a lot of gin places did this, called Archie Rose. They were really concerned that their 15 bar staff would lose their job because they were forced to close the bar. They could still make gin, of course, and sell it online, but they decided to help keep their bar staff. And also there was a massive shortage of hand sanitizer across the world. Within 3 days, they swapped their production from making gin to producing 7,500 bottles of hand sanitizer in 3 days. So in 3 days, they'd got all the legal requirements. They changed their production. They designed and printed labels. They sourced bottles. And over the next few months, they had made over 100,000 bottles of hand sanitizer, not only kept their 15 bar staff, but were then able to employ another 15 people from the region who had lost their job in the hospitality industry. So you could look at that and you could go, oh, well, that's a challenge story. It's a community story. It's probably a culture story because it's living their values. If they continue to make hand sanitizer, it becomes a creation story for that product. So it doesn't really matter where it falls into, just as long as that story is shared. And again, I interviewed them for the book, and I interviewed the head of marketing, and she said that once that story sort of got out there, it went global. Like, they were interviewed on Japanese TV, around the world they were interviewed. She said it increased their database by 100%. Their database over the next few months doubled. And she said, as a brand, because the company is only about 5 years old, she said, as a brand, she believes it increased their brand awareness by 12 to 18 months. That's the exposure of that story. Now, she said, we didn't do it to create the story. Of course, we're not talking about doing stuff to create a story, but really, really good benefit if you can do something and share and get the story out there.
Fascinating. What a great example. Well, Gabrielle, again, I'm super excited to dive into this book over the next few days. I appreciate you sending me my copy, and encourage everyone else to go find Magnetic Stories and dive into, because it sounds like there's some excellent material in this book. So thank you again so much for taking the time to just share some of your insights, some of your research, your hard work that went into this. And, as we wrap up here, if there are listeners that want to get a hold of you or want to learn more about your book, Magnetic Stories, or any of your other books, what's the best way for them to do that?
Oh, look, you can order the book at any of the, bookstores online, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all that type of stuff. The website's GabrielleDolan.com. So there's a whole lot of free stuff around storytelling in there, and all the other books. Or connect with me on LinkedIn or Instagram, all the usual socials.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for taking the time today. This has been excellent. Hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Garrett. Love talking to you.